After rescuing the girl from her alcoholic father, Navy SEAL Andrew Hayes believed the worst was behind them. With her father in custody, it seemed Emily could finally start building a normal life. But the system had other plans, and Andrew would soon discover that Emily's fight for safety and healing was far from over. Before we dive into part 2 of this incredible story, leave a comment where you're watching from, and if you like this video, don't forget to subscribe. A cool breeze swept through the parking lot of the police station as Andrew and Emily exited the police car. Emily's steps faltered as they approached the entrance, her exhaustion from the day's events evident in her slumped shoulders and weary eyes. An officer, a middle-aged man with a kind face, gently guided them toward the building's glass doors. "This way, please," he said, his voice soft but firm. "We'll get you settled in no time." As they walked through the station's corridor toward the social worker's office, Emily's attention was suddenly caught by a commotion to their left. Her father, James, was being led to the booking area by another team of officers. She froze mid-step, her face a mixture of concern and sadness, as she watched James's slouched form disappear around a corner. Andrew noticed Emily's hesitation and gently placed a hand on her shoulder. "Let's go," he said softly. "We should let the police do their work." Emily nodded, her eyes lingering on the spot where her father had vanished, before she turned to follow Andrew and the officer. The fluorescent lights overhead buzzed faintly, creating an almost surreal atmosphere as they made their way down the corridor. They arrived at a door marked Social Services, and the officer knocked twice before opening it. Inside, a woman in her late 40s with graying hair and kind eyes stood up from behind a desk. "Hello," she said, her voice warm and professional. "I'm Mary Gardner, the social worker assigned to Emily Larson's case. Please come in and have a seat." Emily sank into one of the chairs opposite Mary's desk, the weight of the day's events seeming to press down on her small frame. Andrew took the seat next to her, his posture alert despite his own fatigue. Mary settled back into her chair, her eyes focused on Emily. "Emily, I know this has been a difficult day for you," she began. "I'm here to help make sure you're safe and taken care of. Can you tell me if you have any family members we could contact?" Emily hesitated, her eyes darting to Andrew before returning to Mary. She shook her head slowly. "No," she said softly. "It's just been me and Dad for a long time." Mary nodded, her expression sympathetic. "I understand, in cases like this where there are no immediate family members available, we typically need to arrange emergency foster care for minors. It's a temporary solution to ensure you have a safe place to stay while we sort everything out." Emily's eyes widened slightly, a flicker of fear crossing her face. "Foster care," she repeated, her voice trembling. Andrew leaned forward, his brow furrowed with concern. "Is there no alternative?" he asked. "She's been through so much already." Mary sighed, her voice gentle but firm as she explained, "I'm afraid it's a legal requirement. We need to ensure Emily is in a safe, supervised environment, especially given the circumstances of her case." The serious tone of the discussion hung heavy in the air, the fluorescent lights overhead seeming to buzz with the tension in the room. Just as Emily opened her mouth to speak, a sharp knock at the door interrupted them. Mary looked up, surprise evident on her face. "Come in," she called. The office door swung open, revealing an elderly woman standing in the doorway. Her appearance was dignified despite the obvious signs of a rushed journey, a slightly askew cardigan, wisps of grey hair escaping from her otherwise neat bun. Emily's reaction was immediate and startling. She leapt from her chair with a cry of "Grandma!" that made everyone in the room jump. The woman's face lit up with a mixture of relief and joy. "Emily, my dear girl," she said, her voice warm and slightly breathless. Mary and Andrew exchanged surprised glances as Emily rushed into her grandmother's arms. The woman held Emily tightly, one hand stroking her hair as she murmured soothing words. After a moment, the woman looked up, her eyes meeting Mary's confused gaze. "I'm Victoria Jensen," she said, her voice steady despite the emotion of the moment. "I'm Emily's step-grandmother." Victoria gently disentangled herself from Emily and stepped forward, extending her hand first to Mary, then to Andrew. "Thank you," she said to Andrew, her grip firm. Thank you for saving my granddaughter." Andrew nodded, still processing this unexpected turn of events. "I'm glad I could help," he said. Mary cleared her throat, her professional demeanor reasserting itself. "Ms. Jensen, I'm a bit confused. Emily told us she had no family members we could contact." Emily, who had returned to her seat, looked down at her hands. I'm sorry, I wasn't sure if I should bother Grandma," she said softly. "We haven't seen each other in a long time, but she was always nice to me." Victoria's face softened as she looked at Emily. "Oh, sweetheart, you could never bother me." She turned back to Mary, her expression becoming more serious. "I'm James's stepmother. His father married me the same year James's mother passed away. I tried to love James as my own, but—" She trailed off, a hint of old pain in her eyes. "It's been 8 years since I've seen James or Emily," Victoria continued. "James, he never really accepted me, even when he was young. As he got older, he became more distant, and eventually, he cut off all contact. He wouldn't let me visit Emily." Mary nodded, her pen moving across her notepad as she took notes. "I see. And how did you learn about today's situation, Ms. Jensen?" Victoria took a seat next to Emily, reaching out to hold her hand. "A neighbor called me. We've stayed in touch over the years, and when she saw the police at James's house, she let me know right away. I came as soon as I heard." "And you're willing to take custody of Emily?" Mary asked, her tone cautious but hopeful. Victoria nodded firmly. "Absolutely, I have a spare room and I'm financially stable. I've missed so much of Emily's life already. I want to be there for her now if she'll have me." Emily looked up, her eyes shining with unshed tears. "Really?" she asked, her voice small and hopeful. Victoria squeezed her hand. "Really, sweetheart, if that's what you want." Mary leaned forward, her expression serious. "Ms. Jensen, I'll need to conduct a thorough evaluation to ensure you're a suitable guardian. Can you provide details about your current living situation and financial status?" For the next hour, the office was filled with the steady hum of conversation as Mary conducted her evaluation. Victoria answered questions about her address, her income, her health, and her ability to care for a teenager. Throughout it all, Emily sat quietly, her hand still clasped in her grandmother's, as if afraid to let go. As the sun began to set outside the office window, casting a warm glow across the room, Mary finally set down her pen with a satisfied nod. "Well, Ms. Larson, everything seems to be in order. Given the circumstances and with Emily's agreement, I believe placing her in your care would be the best solution." Emily's face lit up, the first real smile of the day spreading across her features. "Really? I can go with Grandma?" Mary nodded, smiling back. "Yes, Emily. Your grandmother meets all the requirements for a legal guardian. You won't have to go into foster care." Andrew, who had been a silent observer throughout most of the process, felt a wave of relief wash over him. The warm family interaction before him was a stark contrast to the tense, fearful atmosphere of earlier in the day. As Mary began preparing the necessary paperwork, Andrew caught Emily's eye and gave her a reassuring nod. For the first time since he'd met her on that fateful bus ride, Emily looked truly hopeful about her future. The fluorescent lights of the police station seemed harsher now, casting stark shadows as the group left Mary's office. Victoria held the freshly signed custody papers in one hand, her other arm wrapped protectively around Emily's shoulders. Andrew walked slightly ahead, his military training evident in his alert posture. They had almost reached the exit when a commotion from a nearby corridor caught their attention. Andrew tensed, instinctively moving to shield Emily and Victoria, as a group of officers rounded the corner, escorting a familiar figure. James stumbled slightly as the officers guided him towards a detention cell. His earlier drunken aggression had faded, replaced by a cold, calculating hatred that seemed to radiate from him. His eyes swept over the group, narrowing as they landed on Emily and Victoria. For a moment, it seemed as though James might remain silent, content to glare at them as he passed. But then his gaze shifted to Andrew, and his face contorted with rage. "You!" James spat, lunging forward against the officer's grip. "You will regret this." His voice echoed through the corridor, causing nearby officers to tighten their hold on his arms. Emily flinched, pressing closer to Victoria, who instinctively tightened her embrace. Andrew stood his ground, his expression impassive as he met James's furious gaze. He said nothing, but his body language spoke volumes. He was ready to act if James made any move towards Emily or Victoria. Mary, who had followed them out of her office, stepped forward. "Mr. Larson, I suggest you focus on your own situation right now," she said, her voice firm and professional. James's attention snapped to Mary, his lips curling into a sneer. "You don't know anything," he growled. "None of you do. You think you're helping, but you're just making things worse." One of the officers restraining James gave him a firm shake. "That's enough," he said. "Move along." As the officers continued to escort James away, he called over his shoulder, "This isn't over. You hear me, Emily? This isn't over." Emily buried her face in Victoria's side, her shoulders shaking slightly. Victoria stroked her hair, murmuring soothing words too low for the others to hear. Andrew watched James disappear around a corner, his jaw clenched. Only when James was out of sight did he relax slightly, turning back to Emily and Victoria. "Are you both all right?" he asked softly. Victoria nodded, though her eyes were wide with shock. "Yes, I think so. Emily, sweetheart?" Emily lifted her head, her eyes red-rimmed but dry. She nodded silently, offering Andrew a weak smile. "I just want to go home. Can we go now?" Victoria squeezed Emily's hand. "Of course, sweetheart. If Ms. Gardner says it's okay, we can leave right away." Mary nodded, her expression sympathetic. "Yes, I think that would be best." She stepped forward, her clipboard clutched to her chest like a shield. "And I'm so sorry about that," she said. "I'll make sure to note this incident in the file. It may affect any future custody hearings." Andrew nodded, his expression grim. "Good," he said. "Is there anything else we need to do here?" Mary shook her head. "No, you're free to go. The officers will keep us updated on Mr. Larson's case, and we'll pass that information along to you, Ms. Larson." Victoria nodded, her arm still around Emily. "Thank you for everything, Ms. Gardner." As they made their way out of the station, Andrew hung back slightly to speak with one of the officers. "I'd appreciate it if you could keep me informed about James Larson's case as well," he said quietly. The officer nodded, making a note in his pad. "Of course, sir. We'll keep both you and Ms. Jensen updated on any developments in the case." Andrew rejoined Emily and Victoria as they stepped out into the cool evening air. The sun had set, leaving the sky a deep indigo, streetlights flickering to life around them. "Let's get you both home," Andrew said, his voice gentle but firm. "It's been a long day." The police station parking lot was bathed in the soft glow of streetlights as Andrew, Emily and Victoria made their way towards Victoria's car. The events of the day seemed to hang over them like a heavy cloud, their exhaustion evident in every step. Victoria fumbled slightly with her keys, her hands shaking from the lingering adrenaline of the confrontation with James. "Andrew," she said, turning to face him, "can we give you a ride home? It's the least we can do after everything you've done for Emily." Andrew shook his head, a small smile on his face. "That's very kind of you, but I'll be fine taking the bus. You two should get home and rest." Victoria's brow furrowed with concern. "Are you sure?" "It's no trouble at all." Emily, who had been quiet since the encounter with her father, spoke up. "Please, Andrew, I'd feel better knowing you got home safely." Andrew hesitated for a moment, then nodded. "All right, if you're sure it's not an inconvenience, but I live quite far from here, near the SEAL headquarters close to the beach area. Perhaps you could just drop me off at the Oak Ridge Community Center. I can easily get home from there." Victoria nodded, relief evident on her face. "Of course, that's no problem at all." As they got into the car, the setting sun cast an orange glow over the scene, painting the world in warm hues that belied the tension of the day. Andrew settled into the back seat, while Emily sat up front with her grandmother. Just before Victoria started the car, Andrew leaned forward, discreetly slipping a business card into Emily's hand. "If you need anything," he whispered, "anything at all, don't hesitate to call, and remember, I promised to help with the prosthetic. We'll make that happen." Emily's eyes widened slightly, a spark of hope lighting up her face for the first time since they'd left the station. She nodded, quickly tucking the card into her pocket as Victoria turned the key in the ignition. The drive to the community centre was quiet, the car's interior filled with a mixture of emotional exhaustion and unspoken thoughts. Victoria navigated the familiar streets with practiced ease, her eyes occasionally flicking to Emily in the passenger seat. After a few minutes of silence, Victoria cleared her throat. "Emily, sweetheart," she said softly, "I know this has been a difficult day. If you want to talk about anything, I'm here to listen." Emily was quiet for a moment, her gaze fixed on the passing streetlights. When she spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "I keep thinking about Dad, the way he looked at us in the station. I've never seen him like that before." Victoria's hands tightened on the steering wheel. "Your father, he's struggling with a lot right now, but that doesn't excuse his behavior. You know that, right?" Emily nodded, her eyes filling with tears. "I know, it's just, he wasn't always like this. He used to be different." From the back seat, Andrew leaned forward slightly. "People can change, Emily," he said gently. "Sometimes for the worse, but also for the better. Your father's actions are his responsibility, not yours." Emily turned slightly in her seat, offering Andrew a watery smile. "Thank you," she said, "for everything. I don't know what would have happened if you hadn't been on that bus today. He probably would have hit me with that bottle when I spoke up to him about my feelings." The car pulled up in front of the Pinewood Community Centre, the building's clock tower showing 6 p.m. Andrew unbuckled his seatbelt, pausing before he opened the door. "You're stronger than you know, Emily," he said. "Both of you are. Take care of each other, and remember, I'm just a phone call away if you need anything." As Andrew stepped out of the car, Victoria rolled down her window. "Thank you again, Andrew. We'll be in touch about the prosthetic appointment." Andrew nodded, watching as the car pulled away and disappeared down the road. He stood there for a moment, the events of the day replaying in his mind. Then, with a deep breath, he turned and made his way to the nearby bus stop, his mind already working on the next steps to help Emily. The bus arrived just as Andrew reached the stop, its doors hissing open with a mechanical wheeze. He climbed aboard, tapping his payment card and choosing a seat, the same one he'd occupied that morning when he first observed the scene between James and Emily. The irony wasn't lost on him as he settled in for the hour-long ride to the beach area. The bus was nearly empty, only a handful of passengers scattered throughout. As the familiar streets of Oakridge began to slip by outside the window, Andrew pulled out his phone. He scrolled through his contacts until he found the name he was looking for, Dr. Jonathan Emilio Rea, his military doctor friend. The phone rang twice before a crisp, professional voice answered. "Dr. Rea speaking." "Jonathan, it's Andrew," he said, keeping his voice low out of consideration for the other passengers. "I hope I'm not catching you at a bad time." "Andrew, no, not at all. What can I do for you?" Andrew took a deep breath, organizing his thoughts. "I need your help with something. It's about a young girl who needs a prosthetic arm. I was hoping you might be able to consult on her case." There was a brief pause on the other end of the line. "Of course," Dr. Rea replied, his voice filled with curiosity. "Can you give me some more details?" For the next few minutes, Andrew gave Dr. Rea a concise overview of Emily's situation, careful to maintain her privacy while providing the necessary medical information. "I see," Dr. Rea said when Andrew finished. "It sounds like a complex case, but certainly one we can help with. I'd be happy to schedule a fitting and checkup. How does tomorrow work for you and the family?" Andrew felt a wave of relief wash over him. "Tomorrow would be perfect. Thank you, Jonathan. I'll confirm with the girl and her family and call you back with the details." After ending the call, Andrew leaned back in his seat, a small smile playing on his lips. One hurdle cleared. But as he pocketed his phone, a sudden realization hit him. He had failed to get Victoria's contact information. "Damn," he muttered under his breath. He remembered their address from the social worker's office, but it would be too late to visit them tonight to discuss the prosthetic appointment. He made a mental note to stop by their house in the morning. As the bus continued its journey, Andrew found his mind wandering back over the events of the day. He recalled incident in the bus James, grabbing Emily in the air, and threatened her with the beer bottle, the mother with the baby escaping the scene, and the driver's ignorance to testify when he called the police. Then his mind reeled to Emily's words about her father, how James used to be a good, loving man until he lost his job due to corruption and turned to drinking. It wasn't an uncommon story, even in the military. Andrew had seen good men fall prey to corruption, to addiction, to their own demons. The thought troubled him deeply. How easily a person could lose their way, their moral compass spinning wildly until they no longer recognized themselves. He came to a sobering conclusion. Being good wasn't enough. One had to be both good and strong to live a righteous life in this world. It was a delicate balance, one that required constant vigilance and self-reflection. The gentle swaying of the bus and the rhythmic hum of its engine began to lull Andrew into a light doze. His exhaustion was catching up with him, the adrenaline of the day finally wearing off. He allowed his eyes to close, his head resting against the cool glass of the window. He had barely drifted off when a vibration from his pocket jolted him awake. Fumbling slightly, he pulled out his phone, squinting at the unfamiliar number on the screen. "Hello?" he answered, his voice still thick with sleep. At first there was only static on the other end. Then faintly he heard a voice, young, female, and terrified. "Help," the voice whispered. It was Emily, her words broken and unclear. "Scared. Hand. Hurt." Andrew sat up straight, fully alert now. "Emily? Emily, is that you? What's wrong? Where are you?" But before she could answer, the call cut off abruptly. Andrew stared at his phone in disbelief for a moment, before quickly dialing the number back. It rang and rang, but there was no answer. Glancing at the clock on his phone, he saw it was 6:45 p.m. The bus was approaching its last stop in just 10 minutes. Andrew's mind raced, torn between the need to get home and the urgent desire to turn back, to make sure Emily was safe. As he debated his next move, his phone buzzed again. This time it was a call from the police station. Andrew's heart sank as he answered, a sense of foreboding settling over him like a heavy blanket. "Mr. Hayes?" The officer's voice crackled through the phone, tinged with urgency. "This is Officer Martinez from the station. We've been trying to reach you." Andrew's grip tightened on the phone. "I'm sorry, I was on the bus. What's happened?" There was a brief pause, and Andrew could hear the shuffle of papers in the background. "Sir, I'm afraid I have some concerning news. James Larson has been released." The words hit Andrew like a physical blow. "Released?" he repeated, his voice rising slightly. "How is that possible? This was a clear case of domestic abuse." Officer Martinez sighed heavily. "I understand your frustration, sir, but the fact is we couldn't find concrete evidence of him actually hitting the girl. There were threats, yes, and clear emotional trauma, but without physical evidence of abuse." Andrew cut him off, his frustration building. "So you're telling me that man is free to go after everything that happened today, after the scene he caused at the bus and the station? Did you folk even contact the bus company and confirmed the event with the driver?" "Sir, we've made sure to investigate the case per our protocol. He's been released with a court date," the officer explained, his tone apologetic but firm. "And there's a permanent removal of custody order for the girl. He's not allowed to be near her." Andrew ran a hand through his hair, his mind racing. "And you think that will stop him? You heard his threats at the station. He said we'd regret this." Andrew ran a hand through his hair, his mind racing. His thoughts had shifted back to the call he'd received just moments earlier. Emily's panicked voice, her mention of hurt hand, and the abrupt end of the conversation. A cold dread weighed heavily in his chest. He wanted desperately to tell the police about it, but uncertainty held him back. He couldn't trust them until he understood the situation himself. With the call still echoing in his mind, Andrew made the decision to head to Victoria's address. "I see," Andrew said, his voice tight with controlled anger. "Thank you for informing me, Officer Martinez. We're aware of the potential risks, Mr. Hayes. We've increased patrols in the area and—" "Thank you," Andrew interrupted, his decision made. "I appreciate the update. Good night." He ended the call, his mind already formulating a plan. He couldn't rely on the police. He needed to check on Emily and Victoria himself. Andrew stood up, making his way to the front of the bus. "Excuse me," he called to the driver. "I need to make an emergency stop. It's urgent." The driver glanced at him through the rearview mirror. "Sir, I can't just stop anywhere. We have a schedule to keep." "Please," Andrew insisted, his voice low and intense. "A young girl might be in danger. I need to get to her." Something in Andrew's tone must have conveyed the gravity of the situation. The driver nodded, pulling the bus over to the side of the road. "All right, but be careful out there." As Andrew stepped off the bus, the driver called out, "Good luck." Standing on the sidewalk, Andrew quickly dialed for a taxi. As he waited, his mind raced through possible scenarios, each more concerning than the last. The taxi arrived within minutes, and Andrew gave the driver Victoria's address. "Please hurry," he urged. "It's an emergency." As the taxi sped through the night, Andrew's hand hovered over his phone. He debated calling Victoria or Emily, but decided against it. If James was there, a phone call might only make things worse. After what felt like an eternity, but was probably closer to an hour, the taxi pulled up in front of Victoria's house. Andrew's heart sank as he took in the scene. The house was mostly dark, save for a single porch light, casting an eerie glow over the front yard. There was an eerie stillness that set his nerves on edge. He paid the taxi fare and exited the car. As Andrew approached the front door, a chill ran down his spine. The door was slightly ajar, as if it hadn't been properly closed. He reached out, his hand hesitating for just a moment before gently pushing it open. "Emily?" he called softly, stepping into the darkened entryway. "Victoria? It's Andrew. Is everything all right?" The silence that greeted him was oppressive. Andrew's hand fumbled along the wall, searching for a light switch. When he found it, the sudden flood of light revealed a scene that confirmed his worst fears. The living room was in disarray, furniture overturned and pictures knocked from the walls. But it was the small drops of blood and shattered glass on the hardwood floor that made Andrew's breath catch in his throat. His military training kicking in, Andrew moved silently through the house, his senses on high alert for any sound or movement. As he searched, a grim realization settled over him. His decision not to inform the police might have been a mistake, but it was too late for regrets now. He had to find Emily and Victoria, and fast. His eyes fell on a displaced phone on the kitchen counter, explaining the failed callback attempts. As he moved further into the house, Andrew's training took over. He moved methodically from room to room, his senses on high alert for any sound or movement. The first floor yielded no sign of Emily or Victoria, nor any further evidence of violence. Andrew was about to head upstairs when a faint sound caught his attention. It was coming from below. His eyes scanned the room, finally landing on a nearly hidden pull-down attic door in the ceiling. With a growing sense of dread, Andrew reached up and pulled the door open, revealing a ladder leading up into darkness. "Victoria," he called softly as he climbed. "Emily?" As his head cleared the opening, Andrew's eyes adjusted to the dim light filtering through a small attic window, and there, huddled in a corner, he saw a figure. "Victoria," he breathed, rushing to her side. She was bound and unconscious, a nasty gash visible on the back of her head. As Andrew gently shook her, trying to rouse her, his mind raced with questions. Where was Emily? And more pressingly, where was James? Victoria's eyelids fluttered, a low groan escaping her lips as she slowly regained consciousness. Andrew supported her head gently, his eyes scanning for any signs of severe trauma. "Victoria, it's Andrew," he said softly. "Can you hear me? Are you all right?" Her eyes focused on him, confusion giving way to recognition, and then to fear. "Andrew?" she whispered, her voice hoarse. "Oh God, Emily, he took her." Andrew's heart sank, but he kept his voice calm and steady. "Who took her, Victoria? Was it James?" Victoria nodded weakly, wincing at the movement. "He came here so angry, so drunk, he had a beer bottle in his hand." Her voice broke. "He hit me with it when I tried to stop him from taking Emily." Andrew's jaw clenched as he carefully examined the wound on the back of Victoria's head. It was a nasty gash, but the bleeding had slowed to a trickle. "I need to call the police," he said, reaching for his phone. "Victoria, do you know where James might have taken Emily?" Victoria's brow furrowed in concentration. I overheard him on the phone, something about plane tickets. He said he needed to get his passport from home." Andrew's mind raced. James was trying to flee the country, to evade the court order. "When did they leave?" he asked urgently. I'm not sure," Victoria said, her voice trembling. "It feels like it's been hours, but maybe an hour ago. His house isn't far from here." "Oh God, Andrew, what if they're already at the airport?" Andrew was already dialing, his other hand gently squeezing Victoria's shoulder in reassurance. "We'll find her," he promised. "I'm calling the police now, and then I'm going to contact some connections I have at airport security." The call to the police was brief but intense. Andrew quickly explained the situation, emphasizing the urgency of the matter. "You need to move fast," he insisted. "Call the airport, let them know so he can't board a plane, and send a team here with paramedics for Victoria." As soon as he hung up, Andrew was dialing again, this time reaching out to his contact at airport security. "Matthew, I need your help, buddy," he said without preamble. "We're looking for a man and a young girl trying to leave the country. James Larson, mid-40s, brown shirt. The girl is Emily, 14, wearing red pajamas and black legging," he said as Victoria whispered what cloth Emily was wearing. His contact's response sent a wave of relief through him. "You saw them? 15 minutes ago? Okay, find them and please let the boarding staff know about it. Yes, don't approach the man yet. The police are on their way." Ending the call, Andrew turned back to Victoria, who was looking at him with a mixture of hope and fear. "They've been spotted at the airport," he told her. "The security team is tracking them now, and the police are on their way. We're going to get Emily back." Victoria's eyes filled with tears. "Thank God," she whispered. "And thank you, Andrew. I don't know what we'd do without you." Andrew shook his head. "Let's focus on getting you down from here and checked out by the paramedics. Can you stand?" With Andrew's support, Victoria managed to get to her feet, though she swayed unsteadily. Slowly, carefully, they made their way down the attic ladder and into the living room just as the sound of sirens filled the air. As the police and paramedics arrived at Victoria's house, the scene quickly transformed from eerie silence to organized chaos. Victoria, still shaken but more alert now, was being attended to by paramedics in the living room while providing her statement to the police. "He came with 2 bottles of beer in his hand," Victoria explained, wincing as a paramedic cleaned the wound on her head. "One was almost empty. When I tried to stop him from taking Emily, he hit me with it. I was dizzy, but I could feel he was taking me somewhere upstairs." Andrew, standing nearby, listened intently, filling in the gaps of what had transpired. "That must have been when Emily had the chance to call me," he added. "I was on the bus, half asleep. The connection was poor, but I could hear her saying something about needing help and being hurt. I thought she said her hand was wounded." Victoria shook her head slightly. "It was my head, not her hand. You must have misheard." A police officer, notepad in hand, looked up from his writing. "Was Emily injured in any way that you could see, Ms. Jensen?" Victoria's eyes filled with tears. "Not while I could still see her, but after James locked me in the attic, I could hear her shouting. There was another sound of a bottle breaking, but I don't know what happened after that." Another officer, who had been inspecting the house, joined the conversation. "We found a broken bottle in the lawn near the car driveway. It looks like James might have used it to threaten her." Andrew frowned, his military mind analyzing the situation. If he was planning to take her to the airport, he wouldn't have hurt her. He'd need her to be able to walk and not draw attention. Victoria suddenly let out a sob, her composure cracking. "This is all my fault. I shouldn't have opened the door to James, especially after the police update earlier. He promised me he would stay sober. I didn't know he was already carrying alcohol when he arrived." The officers exchanged glances, and one gently asked, "Can you tell us exactly what happened when you opened the door, Ms. Jensen?" Victoria took a deep breath, steadying herself. "When I opened the door, James, he wasn't the son I knew. He was aggressive, pushy. Before I could react, he had overpowered me and forced his way inside. It all happened so fast. The officer nodded. We've got units en route to the airport. We're doing everything we can to find them, sir. Andrew nodded, but the tension in his jaw betrayed his worry. He knew from experience that in situations like these, every minute counted. As he watched the paramedics prepare to take Victoria to the hospital for further treatment, he made a silent vow to Emily. He would find her, no matter what it took. As the group dispersed, Andrew approached Victoria. They want to take you to the hospital to check you out, he said gently. I'll follow if that's all right with you. Victoria nodded gratefully. Of course, Andrew. I'd appreciate that very much. As the paramedics helped Victoria onto a stretcher, her eyes meeting Andrew's, her face a mixture of pain and lingering fear. Thank you, she said softly, for everything. As the paramedics prepared to take Victoria to the hospital for further examination, Andrew found himself drawn into a huddle with the detective and several officers. They spoke in low voices, discussing next steps, increased patrols, and the need for protective measures for Emily and Victoria. Through it all, Andrew's eyes kept returning to Victoria. He knew the ordeal was far from over, but for now at least she was safe. When the paramedic asked if he joined in, he nodded and climbed into the back of the van, staying close to Victoria. The ambulance siren wailed through the night, its urgent cry parting traffic as it sped towards the hospital. Inside, Victoria lay on a stretcher, her face pale but determined. Andrew sat beside her, his eyes constantly checking his phone for any updates on Emily's whereabouts. As they arrived at the emergency room, doctors quickly took charge of Victoria's care. We need to get her to radiology for an MRI after I clean the wound and stitch it, one doctor announced. We need to check for concussion and internal bleeding. Andrew nodded, stepping back to let the medical team work. He turned to the police officer who had accompanied them. Any news on Emily? The officer shook his head. The team is coordinating with airport security. Last I checked on my way to the hospital, they said they were closing in on them. Just then Andrew's phone rang. It was the airport security contact he had reached out to earlier. Mr. Hayes, we've got them. James Larson was apprehended at the boarding gate. The girl is safe. Andrew let out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. Thank God, is the girl all right? There was a pause on the other end of the line. She's okay, but there are some bruises on her residual limb. Apparently, when we tried to apprehend James, he attempted to escape while pulling her along. She hit someone's luggage and injured her limb. Andrew's heart sank at this news. I understand. Is she being brought to the hospital? Yes, an ambulance is on its way with her now. After ending the call, Andrew relayed the information to the police officer and the medical staff. The news of Emily's rescue spread quickly, bringing a sense of relief to the tense atmosphere of the ER. About an hour later, Emily hurried into the hospital, her eyes darting down the corridor until they found Victoria. Tears filled her eyes as she rushed to her mother's side, carefully wrapping her good arm around her. Victoria, though pale and visibly in pain, mustered a weak but comforting smile. An officer approached, delivering the latest update. James had been taken into police custody for further investigation. After excusing himself, the officer departed, leaving Andrew to issue a final reminder not to let the drunken man slip through the system again. With that, Andrew turned his attention fully to Emily and Victoria, his expression softening as he took in the emotional reunion before him. I'm okay, sweetheart, Victoria whispered, brushing Emily's hair back. Don't worry, I see you have a wound here on your arm. We'll let the medical team check it for you, okay? Emily nodded tearfully and hugged her. Their embrace was cut short as a nurse arrived, announcing it was time for Victoria's MRI. Reluctantly, Emily let go, watching as her mother was wheeled down the hallway. Before the doors swung shut behind Victoria, she turned and called softly, I'll be back soon. Be brave, okay? Emily nodded, biting her lip to keep from crying, and a nurse gently guided her toward an examination room. There, the doctor who had been attending Victoria now began carefully inspecting her residual limb, speaking in calm tones. There's quite a bit of bruising, the doctor observed, carefully applying a cold compress. Do you currently have plans for a prosthetic? We may need to delay any fitting until this heals. The pressure from a prosthetic could aggravate the bruising and even lead to ulceration. Andrew, who had been hovering nearby, spoke up. I have a connection with a military doctor who specializes in prosthetics. Would it be all right if I called him for a consultation? The doctor nodded. Of course, it would be good to get a specialist's opinion. As the doctor continued treating Emily, Andrew stepped out to make the call. Dr. Jonathan Emilio Rea answered promptly. Jonathan, it's Andrew. Remember that case I mentioned earlier? There's been a development. The girl's residual limb is bruised. Is there any way you could come by the hospital now to take a look? Dr. Rea's tone remained calm and professional. Of course, Andrew. In the military, we often deal with bruising and injuries near prosthetic sites. Depending on the case, there are therapies and medications that can help prepare her arm for fitting, even with minor bruising. If the affected area is minimal, it should be safe to proceed with the checkup first thing in the morning, after a few hours of rest. Minor bruises often heal quickly with proper care. Additionally, if you're open to it, we can discuss the option of a myoelectric prosthetic. Unlike devices operated by cables and harnesses, this advanced prosthetic uses sensors to detect muscle movements and control the limb electronically, reducing strain significantly. Andrew walked to the room and confirmed with the doctor on duty that it was a minimal bruise before he relayed the message to Dr. Rea. That's good news. I believe there's no need to worry for now. Medication and cold compress on the bruise site will help for tonight. Relieved, Andrew thanked him and ended the call. As the night wore on, the bustling activity of the emergency room began to settle into a quieter rhythm. Emily sat on the edge of her hospital bed, her eyes fixed on the cold compress wrapped around her residual limb. The events of the day seemed to weigh heavily on her shoulders, and when she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. Maybe I shouldn't get the prosthetic after all, she said, not meeting Andrew's eyes. It seems like my arm is just causing problems for everyone. Dad always said it made me a burden. Andrew, who had been standing nearby, moved to sit beside her. His voice was gentle but firm when he replied, Emily, listen to me. Your arm isn't the problem here. What happened today, what your father did, that's not because of your arm. It's because of his choices, his addiction. You are not responsible for his actions. Emily looked up at him, her eyes brimming with unshed tears. But if I wasn't, if I was normal... You are normal, Andrew interrupted, his tone brooking no argument. You're a strong, brave young woman who's been through a terrible ordeal, but you're going to get through this. And that prosthetic, it's going to help you live the life you deserve, a life your father's actions can't take away from you. As Andrew spoke, the ER doctor who had examined Emily earlier returned. She had overheard the last part of their conversation and added her own encouragement. I've seen countless patients with prosthetics gain strength and independence, she said, her voice warm with compassion. They work, they play sports, they live full lives. And you know what? Many of them come from challenging backgrounds too. The doctor perched on the edge of the bed, her eyes meeting Emily's. Can I share something personal with you, Emily? When Emily nodded, the doctor continued, I grew up in a broken home too. My parents, they always told me I wasn't smart enough, wasn't capable enough to become a doctor. But I had this amazing teacher in high school who saw something in me that I couldn't see in myself. She supported my dream, pushed me to apply for scholarships, helped me believe in myself. That made all the difference. Emily listened intently, a glimmer of hope returning to her eyes. Really? She asked softly. The doctor nodded, smiling. Really. And now here I am, doing what I love and helping people every day. Emily, don't let anyone, not even your father, tell you what you can or can't do. You have so much potential, and this prosthetic, it's just a tool to help you reach that potential. As the doctor finished speaking, Victoria was wheeled back into the room, her MRI completed. The reunion between grandmother and granddaughter was tearful and joyous. As they embraced, Andrew stepped back, giving them space while he handled the hospital paperwork and bills. When he returned, Andrew had news. I spoke with my friend, Dr. Rea, he said. He's a specialist in prosthetics, and he's agreed to come by tomorrow morning to take a look at your arm, Emily. He thinks there might be some therapies and treatments that could help, even with the bruising. Emily's eyes widened slightly. Really, even with everything that happened? Andrew nodded, a small smile on his face. Really, in the military, they deal with injuries and bruising around prosthetic sites all the time. Dr. Rea thinks we might still be able to move forward with getting you fitted soon. For the first time since the ordeal began, a genuine smile spread across Emily's face. It was small and tentative, but it was there. "Thank you, Andrew," she said softly, "for everything." As the doctor and nurse completed their treatment around her, Victoria was wheeled back into the room, her MRI completed. The reunion between grandmother and granddaughter was tearful and joyous. Victoria reached out to squeeze Emily's hand. "We're going to get through this, sweetheart. Together." As Andrew watched the two of them, he felt a mix of emotions: relief that Emily was safe, concern for her recovery, and a renewed determination to help her get the prosthetic and support she needed. As they embraced, Andrew stepped back, giving them space while he handled the hospital paperwork and bills. The evening progressed. Andrew drove Victoria and Emily back to Victoria's house. The car ride was quiet, each of them lost in their own thoughts about the events of the day. As they pulled up to the house, the reality of what had happened there hit them anew. The front yard, which had seemed so peaceful just days ago, now felt tainted by the memory of James's violence. They stepped out of the car, and Emily hesitated at the edge of the driveway, her eyes fixed on the front door. Victoria placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. "It's okay, sweetheart, we're home now, we're safe." Andrew moved ahead of them, opening the front door and stepping inside first. He flicked on the lights, revealing the aftermath of James's rampage. The living room was still in disarray: overturned furniture, scattered belongings, and evidence markers left behind by the police investigators. Victoria gasped softly at the sight, while Emily's face paled. Without a word, Andrew began picking up the fallen picture frames and setting the furniture right. After a moment, Victoria and Emily joined him, the three of them working in silent unison to restore order to the chaos. As Emily struggled to lift a heavy side table with one arm, she let out a frustrated sigh. "This would be easier with two hands," she muttered. Andrew paused in his tidying, worried that this might trigger another bout of self-doubt. But to his surprise, Emily's face broke into a wry smile. "I guess I really do need that prosthetic, huh? For lifting and all." Victoria chuckled softly, relief evident in her voice. "Well, once you get it, I'll teach you all my secret family recipes. You'll be a master chef in no time." Emily's eyes lit up at this. "Really? You'd teach me to cook?" "Of course, sweetheart," Victoria replied, her voice warm with affection. "We have a lot of lost time to make up for." As they continued cleaning, the mood in the house began to shift. The simple act of restoring order seemed to be therapeutic for all of them, a tangible way of reclaiming the space from the shadow of James's actions. Andrew, who had been quiet for a while, suddenly spoke up. "You know, all this cleaning is making me hungry. How about we order some dinner?" Victoria and Emily exchanged glances, then burst into laughter, a sound that seemed to chase away the last lingering shadows in the house. "Dinner sounds perfect," Victoria said, smiling. "How about I whip up a quick dinner for us?" Emily's eyes lit up. "Really? You're going to cook?" Victoria smiled warmly. "Of course, sweetheart. It's been a long day and we could all use a good meal." Andrew nodded in agreement. "That sounds wonderful. Can I help with anything?" Victoria led them into the kitchen, which thankfully had been spared from most of the chaos. "Andrew, if you could set the table, that would be great. Emily, would you like to help me prepare the vegetables?" For the next half hour, the kitchen was filled with the sounds of chopping, sizzling, and quiet conversation. Victoria moved efficiently around the space, pulling together a simple but hearty meal of chicken stir-fry with rice. Emily watched in fascination as her grandmother deftly handled multiple pans at once. As the aroma of cooking food filled the house, the atmosphere continued to lighten. The simple act of preparing a meal together seemed to further chase away the lingering shadows of the day. They gathered around the dining table, the steaming plates of food before them a comforting sight. As they began to eat, Andrew couldn't help but notice the change in Emily. The fear and uncertainty that had clouded her eyes earlier were replaced by a cautious optimism. Emily was smiling more freely now, her earlier doubts seemingly pushed aside as she and Victoria discussed potential recipes to try once she had her prosthetic. Victoria's eyes shone with a mixture of love and determination, her focus entirely on building a better future for her granddaughter. And Andrew, watching them, felt a deep sense of satisfaction. The road ahead would undoubtedly have its challenges, but seeing the strength and resilience in both Emily and Victoria, he knew they would face those challenges together. As they delved into their meal, the atmosphere in the dining room was one of quiet hope. The warm glow of the overhead light seemed to mirror the warmth of their newfound family connection. Tomorrow would bring new beginnings, new challenges, and new opportunities. But for now, in this moment, they were together, safe, and looking forward to the future.